Greetings. Welcome, everyone. I'm Andrew Peters, one of the organisers for WDA 2024, an international wildlife health conference and a series of pre-conference webinars. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth webinar and the ninth event of our WDA 2024 pre-conference journey. I'm talking to you from Wiradjuri country. It's a cold but beautiful day here. And I'd like to acknowledge that Wiradjuri people have a timeless relationship of reciprocity and responsibility for this country that I'm talking to you from. I'm really profoundly grateful to Wiradjuri and other First Nations elders and teachers for their role in inspiring many aspects of WDA 2024, including this pre-conference webinar series, through their far-reaching acts of wisdom and generosity. We have the great privilege today of listening to Professor Marcia Langton. Marcia is an internationally renowned scholar, writer, and First Nations leader. Her academic background is in anthropology and human geography, but her deep and broad experience and knowledge is informed by more than 5 decades of engagement with First Nations communities right across the Australian continent. When I first imagined this pre-conference webinar series, the very first person that came to mind was Marcia, and she's had a profoundly significant role in my understanding of this continent. I remember as a youth hearing Marcia's words on media, and that really challenging the myths that underpinned my understanding of the Australian continent. So we're incredibly privileged to have her speaking today. For those of you who are following the news, you'll see that a portrait of Marcia won the People's Choice Award at the Archibalds, a portrait by Angus MacDonald. So it's a really striking and very beautiful portrait, in my opinion. And I'd encourage you to have a look for it. That was just news from this morning. I invite you to post your questions in the Q&A panel. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be sent to you. I'd like to thank you again, Marcia, for sharing your time and knowledge with us this morning, and for everyone who's in attendance. So I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, thanks very much, Andrew. It's a great pleasure to be with you here in Australia on this cold morning here in the south. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country, so I acknowledge the traditional owners here in Wurundjeri country and their elders past and present. I've been asked to talk to you about Australian Indigenous concerns with our biodiversity and how Indigenous people seek to protect biodiversity. It's extraordinarily important to me to have this opportunity because, like the rest of the world, Australia is facing a series of crises. I mean, obviously, one of them is climate change, and I won't say much about that. But along with climate change, we have a series of biodiversity crises. And the first one, it must be said, is that Australia has the highest rate of mammalian extinctions in the world. So despite all of the all that's said by politicians about Australian concerns for the environment, one of our most loved animals, even the koala, is now on the list of endangered animals, and it like some other species was brought to the tipping point by Australian wildfires. So the 2019 Black Summer of Fires was particularly disastrous, but there have been a series of major wildfire events causing enormous threats, not only to human life and property, but to our biodiversity. Since the settlers began to radically change our environment. Now, that is not to say that Australia has not faced wildfire on a major scale for millions of years. Of course, Australia is said to be shaped by fire. And we can see in the prehistoric record the way in which fire has shaped the Australian ecosystems and vegetation. But a remarkable thing happened when humans arrived here at least 65,000 years ago. So my ancestors, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, arrived here probably from Southeast Asia, travelling across the Indonesian archipelago. Some came via New Guinea and began to settle Australia, starting in the north of Australia and then spreading, we think, along the river systems and water systems, and faced the propensity for wildfires so that my ancestors very quickly came to an understanding of how to live with fire. And so what our great historian Bill Gamage has called a continent-wide land-managed system developed, and it was based on controlling fire. So in many ways, Australian biodiversity and vegetation systems have been shaped for 65,000 years, at least, by Indigenous land management systems consisting of various methods for controlling and shaping fire. Sorry about this, I'm moving outside. So that's the first major point that I want to make to you. Well, there's a number of points there. One, that human antiquity here goes back at least 65,000 years, that my ancestors shaped the vegetation systems and therefore, to a great extent, biodiversity, habitats on land, and secondly, also developed profoundly important Indigenous knowledge systems, especially related to our environments. And this deep knowledge of the natural world survives in many parts of Australia today. And I believe that our Indigenous knowledge systems are great treasures and ought to receive greater recognition and support from the Australian government. The other thing I want to say is that because of this great body of knowledge and great regard for the environment, it's become tremendously important to Indigenous people to protect what remains of our environment and to protect it in an Aboriginal way. And I'm sharing my screen here. I hope you can all see it. This is a map of Indigenous protected areas as of September 2023. You can see that there are 84 Indigenous protected areas. They're the red areas. And the important thing to say about this map is that more than a quarter of the country, with these red areas and the mauve areas and brown areas included, are the Indigenous environmental areas that are under Indigenous protection. And therefore, I can say with great confidence that Indigenous people have contributed the largest proportion of the Australian land estate and dedicated it to environmental protection. And therefore, the Indigenous people are the most committed environmental protectors and remain so by virtue of having dedicated so much of the Indigenous estate to environmental protection. And the other important thing to say is the extent of Indigenous protection of the environment. And so the total terrestrial area is more than 87 million hectares. And it's calculated now that of the Australian National Reserve System, this is 50%. So of the entire Australian National Reserve System, 50% is contributed by Indigenous landowners. Most Australians don't realise that. They see us as marginal, as inconsequential, and of no relevance to the task of protecting our environment. But that is because of the racist paradigm in the public domain in Australia, which has relegated us to people of no consequence. Last year, in 2023, 61% of Australians voted against a referendum question which asked Australians to consider recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution through a voice. So the vast majority of Australians do not believe that we deserve recognition, and in fact, many have interpreted that dreadful outcome from the referendum as a mandate for extinguishing all of our rights. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the very influential ideas in Western civilization and in the frontier paradigm that still dominates in the Australian public imagination, and that is the idea of wilderness. Now, I believe this is important to explain because when I first became concerned with Indigenous issues and the environment, I looked at maps of Australia and saw that all of our lands, all the Aboriginal land, was labelled on the maps as wilderness. And the environmental conservation groups referred to our lands as wilderness and much else besides. I wrote a book back in the early 90s called Burning Questions. in which I challenge this notion of wilderness. And I'm pleased to see a young generation of geographers and paleontologists and others picking up the baton and challenging this idea of wilderness again, because it has emerged again in the public discourse about Australian environments. And I refer you to this marvellous article by Michael Sean Fletcher, Rebecca Hamilton, Wolfram Dressler, and Lisa Palmer in PNAS, entitled Indigenous Knowledge and the Shackles of Wilderness. And in this marvellous article, they say, ironically, European ideals of protecting a pristine wilderness free from the damaging role of humans is still often heralded as the antidote to this human-induced crisis. Despite decades of critical engagement by Indigenous and non-Indigenous observers, large international non-governmental organisations, philanthropists, global institutions and nation-states continue to uphold the notion of pristine landscapes as wilderness in conservation ideals and practices. In doing so, dominant global conservation policy and public perceptions still fail to recognise that Indigenous and local peoples have long valued, used and shaped high-value biodiverse landscapes. And this exclusion of people from many of these places under the guise of wilderness protection has degraded their ecological condition and is hastening the demise of a number of highly valued systems. Rather than denying Indigenous and local people's agency, access rights and knowledge in conserving their territories, we draw upon a series of case studies to argue that wilderness is an inappropriate and dehumanising construct, and that Indigenous and community conservation areas must be legally recognised and supported to enable socially just, empowering and sustainable conservation across scale. And this is exactly what I said 30 years ago. And many Indigenous people in Australia joined forces in order to prevent this dominant idea, Western idea of wilderness, from dispossessing us even further and disengaging us from our ancestral homelands. And as a result, not only did we achieve some forms of land rights and eventually recognition of native title, but also in the Indigenous protected areas, the map of which I showed you earlier, in order to be able to protect our environments. So that was a tremendously important development. I'll leave it to you to read this marvellous article and the case studies. But in concluding in this essay, this article, there are some very important points made that I want to cite here. It's important to understand that there is a path out of this, the grip of this false notion of wilderness, and it is hearing Indigenous voices. And I'll read again from this paper. Despite sustained critique by Indigenous peoples, Indigenous scholars and various others in the academia and civil society, the continued use of the wilderness moniker or name in conservation practice serves only to disempower Indigenous and local peoples and to deceive non-Indigenous people into the false belief of a transcendent nature free from the influence and active intervention of humans. It is past the time to abandon the wilderness trope to deprioritise disembodied notions of objectivity and universality, and to embrace situated Indigenous and local knowledge systems in scaled and relational approaches to ecosystem and land scale management. So that is a fundamental point that I want to leave you with today as you consider wildlife preservation. And it seems extraordinarily important to me also to explain that along with this critique, which we began many years ago, it's important to say that the knowledge of our environment embedded in our Indigenous knowledge systems is an invaluable set of tools for preserving our environment, and which Indigenous people seek to share with non-Indigenous Australians. Sadly, I have to say that there's a great resistance to that, and it seems to me particularly stupid to refuse the offer that Indigenous people make to understand our Indigenous knowledge systems and use what we know to help preserve our environment and our biodiversity. I'll give you this one example of why it is so important. As I said earlier, Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal peoples have learnt over millennia how to live with fire and have what Bill Gamage, our great historian, called a continent-wide land management system based on controlling fire. In the Australian summer of 2019 to 2020, wildfires exploded in the forests and scrublands in many parts of Australia, with fatal consequences for people in the path of the fires, wildlife and environments. This season of fire left Australians in a state of shock at the devastation. They recognise that climate change will trigger more intense and frequent fires. On 20th of February 2020, the Australian government established the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements to learn from this devastation. The Royal Commission was established to ensure Australian governments better coordinate their responses to limit the deadly and destructive impacts of bushfires. And as I said earlier, this was only the most recent of the wildfire disasters that have beset Australians since colonisation began, but it was a particularly terrible one. And one that, despite all of the experience, Australian governments and agencies were not prepared for, and the consequences were terrible. The Royal Commission published a map of the extent of the fires across Australia from 1 July 2019 to 25 May 2020, which presented a disturbing picture of the loss of biodiversity and natural resources. And this is what the Royal Commission had to say. Over 24 million hectares were burnt. Many Australians were impacted directly or indirectly by the fires. Tragically, 33 people died, and extensive smoke coverage across much of eastern Australia may have caused many more deaths. Over 3,000 homes were destroyed. Estimates of the national financial impacts are over $10 billion. Nearly 3 billion animals were killed or displaced, and many threatened species and other ecological communities were extensively harmed. Every state and territory suffered fire to some extent. The fires did not respect state borders or local government boundaries. On some days, extreme conditions drove a fire behaviour that was impossible to control. And the season was not declared over until 31 March 2020. And so Australians throughout much of Eastern Australia and parts of Western Australia and North Australia were impacted by uncontrollable wildfires for at least 3 months. And as I said earlier in relation to the koala, for some species, this was the tipping point and more have become endangered. Australian extinction rates were already among the highest in the world before the Black Summer. In the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America of April 2015, Winarski, Burbidge and Harrison wrote, the 29 Australian endemic mammal extinctions comprise 35% of the world's modern mammal extinctions. So in other words, more than a third of the world's modern extinctions have been contributed by negligent Australian practices. And that includes ignoring Indigenous knowledge systems or the vast bodies of knowledge that Indigenous people have developed over more than 6 millennia to protect our environments. They go on to say some 1.5% of the world's 5,500 mammal species are extinct, a proportion substantially less than for Australia. Our assessment of 30 Australian mammal extinctions is also appreciably greater than that recognised under Australian environmental legislation, which lists 20 Australian mammal species as extinct. They describe an extent of recent and ongoing loss of its mammal fauna that is exceptionally high and appreciably greater than previously recognised. And they conclude that causes of loss are unlike biodiversity decline elsewhere in the world. While much of the evidence is unclear, there can be no doubt that colonisation of Australia by the British is correlated with species extinction in a broad sequential wave beginning from the first settled areas in southeastern Australia to the present day in much of northern Australia, and the loss of Indigenous land management, particularly of fire. The losses are continuing. A further 56 Australian land mammal species are threatened and 52 species are near threatened. In summary, of the 273 Australian endemic land mammal species, 11% are extinct, 21% are extant but threatened, and a further 15% are near threatened. Because of this biodiversity crisis, Indigenous Australians are saying that our practices of what we call cultural burning or traditional Aboriginal fire management practices must be used. And a number of submissions were made to the Royal Commission by Indigenous people about this, because a large part of the solution to this ongoing disaster is provided by our tradition of fire management practices. And I'm pleased to say that the Royal Commission found this to be the case. In its very impressive document containing 80 recommendations, the Royal Commission made 2 that I want to draw to your attention. It urged that Australian state, territory and local governments should engage further with traditional owners, traditional Aboriginal owners, to explore the relationship between Indigenous land and fire management and natural disaster resilience, and to further opportunities to leverage Indigenous land and fire management insights in the development, planning and execution of public land management activities. In other words, the Royal Commission said work with Aboriginal traditional owners and learn from them in order to protect our our landscapes, and our biodiversity. And these recommendations were based on evidence from across the country about cultural burning. An entire chapter of the Royal Commission report, chapter 18, was dedicated to Indigenous land and fire management and compiles the evidence provided by Aboriginal land managers who fight fire with fire. My observation is that this recommendation of the Royal Commission has been to a great extent ignored, and Australians in the future will face the consequences, terrible consequences, of ignoring this very important recommendation of the Royal Commission. In one of the submissions, a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous experts, including Michael Sean Fletcher, whose wilderness paper I cited earlier, and our University of Melbourne forestry management people, raised their primary concern, and it is the urgent need for traditional Aboriginal fire management practices to be implemented to manage wildfires and limit their impacts in the long term. And this is what they said in their submission. It is fundamental that an implementation of cultural burning be planned, led by, undertaken and administered by Indigenous groups that are local to the site of practice. Effort then needs to be made to resource and support the formation of Indigenous bodies, such as the highly successful ranger programs across Australia. Communities and elders still hold much information which is not widely known or shared, and in many areas there has never been Indigenous-led initiatives which allow a safe place for knowledges to be activated. Transformational change is required in the way country is being managed, and we assert that resourcing and partnering with Aboriginal knowledge holders to reinvigorate cultural fire practice, ensuring empowerment and not appropriation, represents a necessary and powerful piece of the suite of measures required for transformational change. And I just want to return then to the map that I showed you earlier of Indigenous protected areas so that you understand just how devastating it is for us to see this, the negligence of Australian governments in following that recommendation and what the consequences are. Now, on this map, which I should share with you, sorry, on this map, southeastern Australia, from Victoria up to almost central Queensland, along the coastal plains and the ranges, the Great Dividing Range, were deeply impacted by the Black Summer fires. And as Michael Sean Fletcher and others note in the paper on wilderness I cited earlier, this is where the British invaders came first and began to eliminate Aboriginal populations or radically reduce them, dispossess them, and thereby also eliminate Aboriginal land management systems. And so it is in those areas most deeply impacted by colonisation that wildfires are the most dangerous and impactful. In the Aboriginal controlled areas, while every now and again there are very dangerous wildfires, the wildfires are largely managed by not just the adult local Aboriginal populations, but particularly by the Aboriginal rangers. So I want to show you something about these. Well, there's a list of the rangers on the left-hand side of the map, but I want to show you a list of these ranger programs, because these are the this is the front line, the Aboriginal front line in protecting our country. So if I can just first of all show you a source that you can turn to explore this further. Let me share the website. It's the National Indigenous Australians Agency. It's the Commonwealth Government agency that has developed the recognition system of our Indigenous protected areas, and as well the Sea Country Indigenous Protected Area Program, evaluation processes, and the ranger programs. So there are some very good maps, as you can see. The program is expanding. So strange to say that the only significant response that we believe will make sense in protecting Australians from wildfire is coming from our traditional owners who are extending the Indigenous Protected Area Program. And these are the names of the organisations and the locations where they're extending the Indigenous Protected Area Program, in addition to those on the map I showed you. So this IPA program was established in 1997. And as I say, it was initiated by the government in response to years of lobbying from our Aboriginal traditional owners and Aboriginal ranger programs. And further, in 2021, a Sea Country IPA program was recognised as part of the Oceans Leadership Package. Further funding was provided in 2022. And as I say, there are now 85 dedicated IPAs, the oldest of which is the Nuntawarrina IPA in the desert, which celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2023. More than 750 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were employed at that time in 2023 in full-time, part-time and casual jobs under the Indigenous Protected Area Program, including approximately 360 women. These 66 Indigenous protected areas have managed activities delivered by Australian government-funded Indigenous ranger programs. So let's have a look at the Indigenous ranger programs. Just very quickly, so Indigenous rangers have been formed, and I met my first ranger program in Arnhem Land back in the early 1980s, when they were not recognised. So these began as voluntary groups of traditional owners to deal with the impacts of weeds and wildfire, imported exotic weeds and wildfire emanating from poorly managed country on neighbouring properties owned by settlers. And so the ranger programs have grown to accommodate a range of practices and duties now recognised by the Australian government. So engaging with community and traditional owners to plan land and water management activities, fire management, including cultural burning and bushfire mitigation, biodiversity conservation, habitat and threatened species management, invasive species management, freshwater and sea country management, strengthening First Nations language and culture, because after all, it is through our languages that our Indigenous knowledge systems are transmitted and our environments are understood conceptually. Cultural heritage protection and maintenance, and these are core to our approach. The sacred sites, the significant sites, the ancestral sites are all core to this continent-wide management system. Intergenerational knowledge transfer, education, training and capability development, biosecurity monitoring, partnerships with research, education, philanthropic and commercial organisations, building and retaining employment in the Indigenous land and water management sector. And so there is an interactive project map which provides a short description of each of the Indigenous Ranger projects, which you can have a look at to understand how this works. Now, you'll remember the earlier map of the Indigenous protected areas, and I pointed out how the areas most impacted by wildfire are those that have had the most historical impact of colonisation, and that is the removal of Indigenous people and their management systems. If you click on the map, you'll see how in areas that Australians regard as empty, there are in fact Indigenous rangers. And you can see here a photograph of 2 Indigenous women rangers with their non-Indigenous counterpart, and they are members of the Kiwi Kura IPA and Rangers. They're part of the Desert Support Services, and they're out there in this extremely remote area of Central Australia. Again, here you can see in the southern Tanami, in the Central Desert, the Walpuri Rangers manage this vast area of land, and most of these ranger programs carry out work that nobody else undertakes. I've observed for many years, for decades, that traditional owners do work that no other agency undertakes. Aboriginal traditional owners have stepped in to undertake this urgent biodiversity protection work because Australian governments in most parts of Australia do not carry out this work. When I did my PhD, or undertook my PhD research in Cape York more than 20 years ago, well, it was actually 30 years ago, I noticed that there were 2 government rangers working in the national parks of Cape York. And of course, you know, obviously the traditional owners were very much aware that these national parks had been stolen from them. And meanwhile, there were thousands of Aboriginal people who were not allowed to manage their country or conduct their traditional fire management practices. Only the 2 authorised white rangers placed there from down south by the Queensland government were permitted to. And you find that still to be the case across many areas of Australia. And it is, in fact, the Aboriginal Ranger programs that protect country. And we use the term country to convey a holistic sense of the habitat on which we as humans and our non-human friends in the natural world depend for our survival, and also all the supernatural influences that provide us with an understanding of the environment developed from ancestral knowledge over 6 millennia. There's so much more to say, and with insufficient time to convey to you all that needs to be said, I think perhaps it's best that I continue to focus on the importance of fire and managing fire in the Aboriginal world. But I want to say a few words about how Bill Gammage came to understand it. Bill Gammage is a wonderful historian, and he undertook to understand what it is that Aboriginal people are talking about when they talk about their ways of dealing with fire. He reviewed thousands of historical documents and photographs to understand this. And he came to a conclusion. And in summary, this is what he wrote in his wonderful book, The Biggest Estate on Earth. Aboriginal people made fire an ally, not an enemy. And that's a very important point, because most non-Indigenous Australians regard fire as the enemy, and they're frightened of it. They're deeply afraid of it. Whereas our people, for generations, have confronted fire and treated fire as an ally and shaped our country using fire. And Bill Gammage was one of the few non-scientists to recognise this. Of course, quite a few scientists came to understand this, but it was Bill Gammage as an historian who was able to show how the evidence for this was always there in Australian historical documents and photographs and paintings. He says that among its advantages, Aboriginal landscape fire gave every species a favourable habitat, letting them flourish and preventing species extinctions, promoted drought-shielding native grasses and shrubs, and minimised the impact of bushfire or wildfire by reducing fuel and by creating fire breaks to break up or isolate areas with dangerous fuel loads. And so you can see why, without our Indigenous knowledge and land management systems, the areas most heavily impacted by the British settlers are the ones with the highest mammalian extinction rates and the worst wildfire impacts, because they removed our systems of fire management. And it has to be said of Gammage's work that he was determined to open the eyes of his fellow non-Indigenous Australians and convey to them the very important point that in 1788, when the British first began to occupy Australia, there was no wilderness, but a landscape that reflected a sophisticated, successful, and sensitive farming regime integrated across the Australian landmass. Fire was not an indiscriminate tool of fuel reduction or grass promotion, but carefully employed to ensure certain plants and animals flourished, to facilitate access and rotation, and to ensure resources were abundant, convenient, and predictable. Now, it has to be said that because of urbanisation and agriculture, there are many areas in New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania especially, where it is no longer possible for Aboriginal people to implement these systems. But that is why the Royal Commission urged the fire management community and Australian government agencies to collaborate with our traditional fire managers to learn what can be learnt now and to apply collaborative techniques, because even in the peri-urban areas, there are still traditional owners controlling fires. And our cultural burning movement has spread across Australia through a wonderful organisation called the Fire Sticks Alliance. And that was started by a young man who wrote a beautiful book about fire, Victor Stephenson. And I urge you to read this book. It's a lovely book, very easy to read. His book is called Fire Country, How Indigenous Fire Management Could Help Save Australia. And he wrote the book to help heal the wounds inflicted on the people and the environment by putting the right fire back onto the land. The fire is just the beginning of an important journey for us all. That's what he wrote in his book. He was in Cape York when I was up there doing my PhD research, and he met two elders that I wrote about in my PhD, George and Tommy, in the little town of Laura in the middle of Cape York. And this is how he writes about his first experience with them. I could see two old men from a distance sitting with their families. I was told that they were brothers and had a reputation as among the most respected and knowledgeable men in the area. I was instantly intrigued by their status and wanted to learn more about them. As I peered over at them, I could see that they were watching me. Even when they weren't looking at me, it felt like they were watching me. They had a really strong presence that I was drawn to, but it made me nervous to think of approaching them. By the end of the day, Tommy George had invited Victor to live in his house, and the story of how ancient knowledge is passed along to the next generation begins in Victor's inimitable bush way with words that are often called yarning. This is a precious written account because it is the only one that I know of that is written in the first person by an Aboriginal person learning from the elders. Both Tommy and George have passed away. They were the last of the Awulaya elders who could give the traditional knowledge and stories of their country to their young people. Others will do so through oral traditions and being on country, but the legacy is a fragile one, as Victor explained. It was an honour to learn from them, but it didn't come without many challenges along the way. You have to develop trust, not just with the old people, but the whole community. It took some time before the old people really started to teach me things. They also found me useful to help them out too around the other life matters. The main thing they wanted was to practice culture and get back onto their country. They wanted to apply their knowledge back onto the land, the fire, the water, looking after the story places. But most of all, they wanted their younger ones to learn the language and get back onto country. It was vital because the two men were the last of the Awulaya elders who knew the traditional knowledge and stories of that country. They wanted the young ones to inherit the knowledge and take over their role as leading elders. The healing knowledge using fire for the land comes from the same knowledge of maintaining country with fire. Healing the environmental problems becomes far more possible if you understand the land through ancient knowledge views. Knowing the values and indicators of each ecosystem allows you to work out ways to adjust the fire management to improve the condition of sick landscapes. Burning outside of the normal times you would burn the country, depending on its identity and condition. Health status of a particular country determines the best possible application of fire. It's sort of like being a doctor for the land, giving a diagnosis and then the treatment. And I think that's one of the best explanations of why our Aboriginal elders, with their incredible knowledge systems, are so important to our future and why we must learn from them. And as Victor says, cultural burning can only be learnt on country by learning from elders. And he writes, I will never forget that day Poppy lit the first fire on country in front of me. We were standing in the middle of a small community of boxwood trees about 20 kilometres out of Old Laura Town. The ecosystem was only as big as a couple of basketball courts and was surrounded by a small creek and stringy bark country. The grass was quite thick, dead and dry, and we were standing in it up to our knees. I'm going to light the grass now, like the old people used to do, Poppy said loudly and proudly. He walked over to the stringy bark country and ripped off a long piece of bark from the closest tree. You look now. He teased one end of the long piece of bark, lit it up, and walked through the boxwood patch in a repetitive figure-8 type movement. He was almost skipping as he dragged the bark along, making the fire follow him around. I watched him dancing through the flames like some kind of fire spirit, sprinkling magic dust onto the land. I watched the fire go higher and the smoke fill the space around him until I couldn't see him anymore. There was nothing but fire in front of me, but it was only seconds before it started to calm down. Then he reappeared in the middle of the fire, walking over the flames with his bare feet, giving me the biggest smile. Scientists, ecologists, historians, and many others have given us other versions of the knowledge that Victor shares, but their sources are the written record, not the oral record from the elders themselves. When Victor uses the word magic, he does so to convey the great subtlety of the practice of cultural burning and the finest understanding of fire and the environment that cannot be learnt from books. Yet these books are important in their own way, because no Australians will ever again experience the teaching of Tommy and George. So Aboriginal fire management is both an ancient and a contemporary practice, which has altered the Australian landscape. European settlers thought the continent was a wild and harsh environment, but in fact what they encountered was a landscape that had been consciously and deliberately shaped by fire by Aboriginal people for thousands of years. And so, in conclusion, I want to say that it is very important to understand that fire management, our environmental values, our approach to protecting the environment, the regard with which we hold non-human species are all part of our Aboriginal laws. And they are part of ordered, patterned and rule-governed Aboriginal belief systems and societies, and all of those range of programs that I've introduced you to operate under Aboriginal laws. And it is well past time for Australians to overcome their racism and learn to understand our traditions and accept them, because it is in their own best interests that they do. It is in the interests of future Australians and the Australia that they claim to care so much about, to have our systems join with theirs to protect our environments. The Australian national symbol on our High Court, in our Parliament, and many of our public buildings is a coat of arms, and on one side there's a kangaroo, and on the other side an emu. In Aboriginal law, these animals are sacred, and they tell us so much about the world and are regarded as if they were deities, because they are representations of our ancestral past, and from which we must learn so much in order to preserve them and all the other non-human species, faunal and floral. For white Australians, their emblem stands for the conquest of nature, and that is not the Aboriginal way. So I wanted to convey to you in this presentation how important it is to look at Aboriginal values in order to preserve our future. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. I hope you've learned something, and I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Langton. We do have one question, if there's time, if you're happy to answer one question from the audience. It's from Rupert Woods. Thank you, Professor Langton and WDA, for a great talk. I'm interested in what we as individuals and as organisations can do to assist in this area. Do you have any advice for us? Leaving this webinar, what would be your recommendation for the top 3 things we can do to help, both immediately, but also more long-term? For those of us who don't already do so, should we all be supporting the Fire Sticks Alliance? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question. Yes, support the Fire Sticks Alliance, support Indigenous rights, and support the recommendations of the Royal Commission into National Disasters. Learn about Indigenous knowledge, learn from Indigenous knowledge holders, and assist in the task of collaborating with us in all of the land management challenges that we have, and involve in traditional owners, Aboriginal traditional owners and their elders. Make sure that your projects have Aboriginal involvement where it is possible to do so, and make sure that Indigenous knowledge systems are respected.
Thank you very much. And one more question just from Nick Doidge that I think is a really important question. As we work towards dispelling the concepts of wilderness in Western societies, should we also be rethinking our ideas of wildlife? Should we be trying to view non-domesticated animals as integrally linked with humans rather than apart from people?
Indeed. I hope I've conveyed in this lecture that my answer to that question is a resounding yes. We must not continue this Western view of conquering nature. We must learn to live with nature. And Indigenous societies, many of them around the world, including Aboriginal societies, have shown us how to do that by holding the natural world in great regard, not as something to be conquered, but as our kin, our relative, our family. And that is the Aboriginal way.
Thank you so much. And we've had quite a lot of thanks coming through the Q&A panel. Just before we finish up, I do want to just recommend to everyone that if you'd like to dig further into Marcia's knowledge and insights, there are a couple of books that I'd recommend, especially for those of you who are coming to Australia for the conference later this year or want to know more. Sorry, this is not a great way to show you this, but Welcome to Country is by Hardy Grant, published by Hardy Grant, is Marcia's travel guide to Indigenous Australia. It has 2 parts to it. It has a section introducing Indigenous cultures, which is an incredibly readable, but also thought-provoking introduction to Australia's First Nations. Then it has an Exploring Indigenous Australia section that that takes you around the country and provides you with a guide that can really give you deep and meaningful experiences as you travel around Australia in coming to understand this country a lot better. I also would recommend the First Knowledge series. These are edited by Margot Neal. I will share the link in future updates. They include a range of texts. Marcia co-authored a book on law, The Way of the Ancestors, with Aaron Korn, and I'd strongly recommend that. And in fact, the entire series as a really profound introduction to traditional knowledges in this continent. Lastly, as the webinar ends, a single survey question will pop up in your browser. We've had many valuable responses to our last webinars, and I'd encourage you to provide just a sentence or 2 to help us plan the rest of these events. Thank you again for your time. I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar and on country and online conferences in December. Please keep an eye on our updates that will be coming out every 1 to 2 weeks over the next few months. There'll be a lot of exciting opportunities for everyone anywhere in the world to be part of these events. So thank you again, Marcia, for your time and your knowledge. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
An absolute pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.